At a recent meeting of Heritage Port, Port Stanley Historical Society, our secretary, Barbara Barnwell, brought with her a booklet entitled Summer Resorts on Lake Erie, the Detroit and St. Clair Rivers, which had been published in 1899 by the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad. The purpose of the booklet was to encourage summer visitors, especially those from the United States, to visit the resorts along the north shore of Lake Erie. Let's look at a map of the Detroit River Railway. Their main railway line ran from Walkerville, across the river from Detroit, to St. Thomas. At St. Thomas, it connected to a line which they had leased from the London and Port Stanley Railway. Another north-south route operated by the same company ran from Rondeau to Sarnia. Most of this video will be taken up with looking at photographs of Port Stanley in the gay 90s and hearing what the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway had to say about summers in our little village. But first, let's consider a little bit more of the history of the London and Port Stanley Railway. In 1856, the London and Port Stanley Railway, the LMPS, ran its first train between London and Port Stanley. At the time, the line was a steam railway. It was only later that it became electrified. The railway company had been formed by a group of London businessmen, with shares being sold to the cities of London and St. Thomas. During the ensuing 148 years, the railway, like Port Stanley itself, has endured many changes of fortune. It is probable that the original investors from London and St. Thomas thought that they could profit from the fast-developing port to the south. Following the opening of the Welland Canal in 1829, settlers and settlers' effects had been pouring into southwestern Ontario through Port Stanley. In 1849, there were only 6 ports in all of Canada which could boast a greater value of imports than Port Stanley. What these early investors failed to foresee was that the rapid spread of railways east and west would provide faster and more convenient access to southwestern Ontario. For many years then, the LMPS was marginally successful as a railroad, deriving much of its revenue by shipping coal from the coal fields of Ohio via Conneaut and Port Stanley to St. Thomas and London. In 1872, the railroad was leased to the Great Western Railway. 10 years later, in 1882, the Great Western Railway was taken over by the Grand Trunk Railway. In 1893, the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway took over the line and operated it from 1894 until 1903. It is this time period, the gay 90s, which will be the subject of this video.
To our patrons, the gospel of rest has been preached by divines, physicians, and journalists with such success that it is now estimated that between 4 and 5 millions of dollars are spent in the aggregate by the people of America in summer recreation. The next question is, where to go? We present in these pages the claims of Port Stanley, Rondeau, the Mettawas, and other resorts as combining all that is needful for healthy, happy recreation. The resorter is in close touch with the railway and steamboat, and should an emergency call for it, can return on short notice. Port Stanley. Port Stanley, it may be said, owes its present development as a commercial and tourist center to the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway, which took control of the London and Port Stanley Railway some 6 years ago. Since that time, considerable improvements have been made, and the traffic has greatly increased each year. The car ferry, Shenango No. 1, from Conoe, Ohio, the Merchants Line from Montreal, and boats of the Lake Erie Navigation Company, Limited, from Cleveland, make regular trips to Port Stanley, in addition to tramp vessels with cargoes of coal and merchandise. The scenery around and about Port Stanley is of the most beautiful description. High bluffs, sloping uniformly, or carved by ages of frost and rain into fantastic pinnacles, level valleys of fertile soil, Kettle Creek winding peacefully towards the lake.
At this point, I'm going to interrupt and tell a story which really doesn't have much to do with this video, because it happened 10 years later. But it's one of my favorite stories, and it does have a lot to do with this picture from the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway brochure. The year was 1910, and Port Stanley's first 3 automobiles had just arrived on a flatbed rail car. By now, the Père Marquette Railway had taken over the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway. The village was pretty well closed down for the day, since everyone was celebrating the coronation of King George V. A large crowd had gathered to watch the first car being unloaded. Mr. Mitchell, the owner of the village sawmill, said that he was prepared to buy one of the cars if it could make it up this hill. Eventually, the owner of the Port Stanley hardware store was found and persuaded to open his store and supply some gasoline. By this time, the entire population of the village seemed to be gathered on the picnic hill. They got the car started, and it coughed and sputtered a bit, but then got going and sure enough made it up the hill. Mr. Mitchell wrote out a check for $1,300 on the spot and became the proud owner of the first automobile, an Everett, in Port Stanley. I want to get back to the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway brochure, but perhaps first I should clarify one point. In 1899, when I was talking about car ferries, such as the Urania, which we saw earlier, I was talking about ferries which carried railway cars, not automobile ferries. So, back to 1899 and the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad tourist brochure.
The village of Port Stanley lies in a valley and contains custom house, post office, telegraph and express offices, hotels, churches, and stores. Passing on through, we come to the harbor, on which a large amount of money is being expended by the government in improvements. The piers are 1,200 feet long. Immediately to the west is the company's slip dock, 800 feet in length, built to accommodate their car ferry, Shenango No. 1. Walking along the beach, the bathing house is reached. This is fitted up with diving platform, safety lines, and other accommodations. The beach is an ideal one for bathers, deepening very gently with a smooth, firm surface, clean and free from pitfalls and entangling weeds. The railway company have extended their tracks along the beach to the foot of the picnic grounds. At this point is the incline railway, and also a long flight of steps reaching the picnic grounds. The incline railway is operated by steam power, and the cars are capable of carrying 50 passengers. The picnic grounds cover some 15 acres, with ample shade of forest giants, and contain space for athletic sports, dancing platforms, etc., etc. Hot and cold water is supplied gratis to picnickers.
I'm going to interrupt once again here because I want you to see this wonderful panoramic shot of the picnic grounds. We are once again stepping a little outside the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad era. Judging by the women's dress in this photograph, I would suggest that it was probably taken about 1915. If you haven't been up to the picnic grounds, now known as Mariner's Bluff, recently, Drive up the Front Street hill and look east from the top of the hill. You are situated exactly where the photographer would have been standing when he took this shot. The change is hard to believe. This photo would have been taken on one of the busy summer weekends in Port Stanley. Let's listen to some ragtime piano music as we slowly scan from north to south. A great photo. But let's get back to 1899 and our Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad brochure.
Immediately adjoining the company's grounds are those of the Fraser House, which are very beautiful, particularly Lover's Walk, where the overarching canopy bars each torrid ray, and whence glorious glimpses of the lake are seen through the trees. A cool and never-failing spring is found here. The Fraser House is admirably situated and has facilities for catering to the needs of almost any number of excursionists. The dining rooms are well appointed and the cuisine excellent. The public rooms are large and commodious. A dancing hall is in connection. The highways around Port Stanley are excellent. Conveyances of all kinds can be hired at short notice and at reasonable rates. The fishing is very good, pickerel, perch, etc., being caught in abundance off the government docks. Larger fish of various kinds are caught by trolling. The boating is a feature of this resort, and craft of different kinds can be hired at reasonable rates. Port Stanley is becoming popular for its mineral baths, which are located north of the village, within an amphitheater of hills, and approached by a short stretch of road. The springs were known 40 years ago, but their medicinal qualities came prominently to the front only within the last few years. The analysis shows that the waters contain large quantities of salts of iron, lithia, potassium, sodium, and calcium, forming an excellent chalybeate water. The rates are very reasonable.
Well, someone was going to ask. Many of our Heritage Port members remember very clearly the distinct smell of sulfur as you entered Port Stanley.
Orchard Beach, on the east side of Port Stanley, enjoys equally attractive scenery, though of a somewhat different character. It too possesses bluffs as a background, two of which are connected by a private bridge. A summer hotel by the appropriate name of Hillcrest is found here. On this elevation is located the Government Meteorological Observatory, and the records show that Port Stanley lies in latitude north 42 degrees 40 minutes, longitude west 81 degrees 13 minutes, height above sea level 592 feet. As a sample of weather, the mean temperature for July 1894 was 68.8, being a degree higher than for 20 years average.
And that was what the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad Passenger Department had to say about Port Stanley in 1899. In their brochure, they have a photograph of their large general offices in Walkerville. On January 1st, 1894, they had leased the L&PS railway tracks for a period of 20 years. The yearly rental was $10,000 plus 10% of all gross earnings over $80,000. Under the terms of the lease, 2 passenger trains were to be run daily, plus summer excursion trains. The fare for the latter was to be 30 cents return to London. Normally, only 2 engines were used on the line, excluding the switch engine, which unloaded the car ferries. But on excursion days, the latter engine was placed on the main line to make up 3 complete trains of 16 cars each. On the days of the Irish, English, Scotch, or farmers' picnics, these 3 trains would operate continuously all day long between London and Port Stanley. The bulk of the railroad revenue would seem to have come from the less glamorous business of transporting coal. Until the 1890s, the coal had been brought into Port Stanley from Ohio in the hold of wooden sailing schooners. Shortly after the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway acquired its lease, the task of transporting coal was switched to ferries, which could handle railroad cars. Some of them also transported passengers. We have already seen the Shenango number 1, but let's look at some more pictures while I read to you from the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway brochure. This steamer is in daily service the entire year, weather permitting, and is equipped with all modern improvements, electric lighting, etc., serving meals and furnishing berths to passengers. Special arrangements for excursion parties. She is licensed to carry 1,200 passengers and 26 freight cars. This is the most direct route between Western Ontario and the American cities of Youngstown, Pittsburgh, McKeesport, Oil City, Erie, and points south of Conneaut Harbor. Another interesting ship, this one a paddle wheel steamer, was the Flora. Ferris, in his masterful thesis on the history of the L&PS, tells us that she was operated by a group of Detroit businessmen for part of one summer before being tied up because of financial difficulties. The Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad purchased her in 1896, rebuilt her, and renamed her the Urania. Her skipper was Captain F.R. Dale, who, quote, took many a happy excursionist on a moonlight cruise over Lake Erie. This was the Captain Dale who later delivered himself of the much-quoted sentiment, "Nowadays, people come to town with a clean shirt and a new $10 bill, and they don't change either." In 1899, the Urania was being operated by the Lake Erie Navigation Company. I presume in collaboration with the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad, since she merits a page in their booklet. The write-up says, "This steamer is lighted throughout by electricity, is excellently appointed in every way for the safety and comfort of passengers. Engines modern and powerful, splendid stateroom accommodation, and well-supplied tables. The shortest and therefore the cheapest route between Western Ontario and Ohio." In 1902, the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad sought to obtain an extension of their lease on the LMPS tracks for a further 30 years. But Adam Beck, later Sir Adam Beck, who was then Mayor of London, refused to consider any lease extension. In 1903, the Père Marquette Railroad purchased the capital stock of the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad Company, and the operating control of the LMPS once again changed hands. Our story of the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad's involvement in Port Stanley has come to an end. Thank you for watching. Heritage Port meetings are held on the third Thursday of every month in the Port Stanley Festival Theatre building. Guests and new members are always welcome to attend.